On 24 October 1944 inches, the narrow waters of the Taiwan Strait, USS Tang, a Gato-class submarine under Commander Richard H. O'Kane, hunted north of Formosa. Her SJ radar painted a Japanese convoy on the scope tanker's freighters escorts etched as pale tracks against the night. Behind her lay 9 months of ruthless efficiency. 33 ships sunk for 11645, 4 tons, a record no other American submarine had matched. Surfacing to close the range, Tang drove straight into the convoy's heart and loosed her remaining bow torpedoes. Explosions punched into steel, ships heaved, and burned the sea lit by sheets of flame. Then the last bow torpedo aimed at a crippled transport ran straight, began to curl, and traced the circular path O'Kane would later describe in his post-war report. Seconds later, it struck Tang's stern. The blast hurled men from the bridge and sent the submarine plunging to the bottom, settling around 180 feet off the China coast. For the Japanese who would later add up the losses, it would be hard to believe that one submarine had cut such a path through their shipping in less than a year. In the shattered hull, men trapped in the forward torpedo room faced a decision with almost no precedent. Momsen Lung's compact emergency breathing devices offered a narrow chance of escape, but they had never yet been used for a wartime ascent from a sunken submarine. 13 men squeezed into the escape trunk and rode the column of water up. Only 5 of them would ultimately survive to be rescued. 4 more blown clear from the bridge and conning tower when the torpedo hit reached the surface amid oil wreckage and burning debris. In the end, 9 of 87 crewmen lived long enough to be taken from the sea. Their survival measured against the silent bodies still inside Tang was a cold statistic on a night already defined by numbers. By dawn, a Japanese escort had hauled the survivors aboard. On its decks, stunned, burned men from ships Tang had sunk recognized the insignia and the faces of the submarine crew who had hunted them through previous convoys. Recognition turned quickly to rage. The captured Americans were beaten and abused, a brutal immediate collision between Tang's lethal efficiency and the human cost it had imposed on Japanese sailors and soldiers. The survivors were sent on to prison camps. Only years later, in the cross-checking of wartime patrol reports and Japanese shipping records, would analysts credit this single submarine with 33 confirmed sinkings. For Japanese officers reviewing those loss tables, the idea that one American boat operating over just 5 patrols had erased so many ships in roughly 9 months was almost beyond belief. Tang's career and her final night showed both the precision and the peril built into the submarine war. Her SJ radar cutting through darkness let O'Kane track and attack convoys, whose escorts often lacked effective radar of their own and depended mainly on sonar and searchlights. Her Gato-class hull, with a 400-foot test depth that she had already exceeded on earlier patrols while dodging depth charges, had proved it could endure punishment in the deep. Yet a single Mark 18 torpedo malfunction, a circular run, ended her record in an instant. The crew's attempt to escape from 180 feet using Momsen lungs was a technical gamble with unforgiving physics balanced between drowning embolism or the slim chance of rescue. Beyond Tang herself, her 9-month campaign through Japan's overstrained shipping lanes was part of a larger submarine offensive that would ultimately sink more than 5 million tons of Japanese merchant tonnage. In that offensive, no other submarine's log looked like Tang's, and for the Japanese whose convoys vanished under her attacks, the record of 33 ships in 9 months felt less like a statistic and more like an impossibility made real beneath the waves. The Taiwan Strait's chaos on 24 October 1944 revealed both USS Tang's lethal precision and the fragility of Japan's maritime lifeline. Her 33 sinkings, totaling 11645, 4 tons in roughly 9 months, would later stun Japanese staff officers who had never imagined that one submarine could inflict such damage. Tang's record was not an anomaly but the concentrated result of a campaign that exploited systemic flaws in Japan's war effort, flaws that her patrols targeted again and again. Japan's pre-war economy leaned heavily on a merchant fleet of more than 6 million gross tons, hauling oil, food, and raw materials from Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific to the home islands. When war erupted in 1941, Japanese naval doctrine still revolved around decisive surface engagements, leaving anti-submarine warfare a secondary concern. Convoys often sailed with too few escorts. Many of them converted vessels that lacked effective radar and carried only basic sonar. By contrast, American submarines operated with surface search radar that gave them a decisive edge at night. Tang, commissioned in October 1943 at Mare Island, embodied this advantage. Under Commander Richard H. O'Kane, who had honed aggressive tactics aboard USS Wahoo, she reached Pearl Harbor on 8 January 1944, ready for combat. Her first war patrol began on 22 January, aimed at the Caroline and Mariana Sea lanes, where Japan's defenses remained thin and its shipping dense. On 17 February, 1944 Tang stalked a convoy in the approaches west-northwest of Truk. Slipping past a lone escort, she fired a 4-torpedo spread at the 6,800-ton freighter Gyoten Maru. 3 hits tore into the ship and sent her stern first under the waves. In the nights that followed, operating along the same routes, Tang struck again, sinking Fukuyama Maru and Yamashimo Maru, both over 3,500 tons, auxiliary hulls that mattered to Japan's garrisons as much as any warship. During one violent depth-charge counterattack, O'Kane drove Tang down past the 600-foot mark beyond the limits of her depth gauges. The Gato-class hull held under the strain proof that the boat could survive in water deeper than official test limits. With all 24 torpedoes expended and 16 hits claimed, Tang put into Midway for refit. Her patrol report later folded into the post-war accounting that confirmed her place atop the submarine tonnage tables. Japanese convoy commanders in those waters could not yet put a name to the unseen assailant, but they knew an unusually aggressive submarine was at work. After the war, Japanese officers would describe how radar-equipped American boats seemed to slash into their formations at night and vanish before escorts could react. Their countermeasures dispersed, routing minimal escort reinforcement, and incremental changes in procedure never caught up with the threat. Tang's second patrol, beginning in March 1944, shifted her to Palau Davao Gulf and the approaches to Truk. Contacts with major merchant targets were limited, but the patrol underscored another dimension of her role. She spent critical days on lifeguard duty rescuing 22 downed U.S. airmen with the help of a Vought OS-2U Kingfisher floatplane that taxied survivors back to the submarine. The crew's endurance stretched over a 50-day patrol cycle, in which hours of tense hunting alternated with rescues conducted under the risk of air and surface attack. O'Kane's preferred method remained the same throughout: night surface attacks at close range, often within 1,000 yards, which minimized the time escorts had to detect and respond. Japanese defenses built around sonar and visual search rather than wide-area radar coverage struggled to counter a boat that could locate convoys at long range on the surface and choose when and where to close. By June 1944, as Tang prepared for her third patrol into the East China and Yellow Seas waters, Japan still regarded as relatively secure shipping losses were already climbing. Across the Pacific, the broader U.S. submarine campaign, conducted by a small fraction of the fleet, would eventually sink more than 5.3 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping and roughly 1,300 vessels. Within that total, Tang's 33 confirmed sinkings formed only a fraction but an outsized one. When Japanese analysts and former convoy officers later compared their loss records with American patrol reports and saw that a single submarine, SS-306, had accounted for 33 ships in about 9 months of operations, the number felt less like a statistic and more like something that should have been impossible until Tang proved otherwise. Japan's maritime lifeline bled under USS Tang's attacks, her 33 credited sinkings in roughly 9 months, exposing how unprepared the Navy was for a sustained submarine war. By June 1944, Tang, under Commander Richard O'Kane, was ready for her third patrol, ordered into the East China Sea and Yellow Sea, routes thick with Japanese shipping, but still thin in modern escorts. Japanese convoy defenses relied heavily on small sub-chasers and converted patrol craft, many with limited sonar and only sporadic radar coverage. A radar-equipped Gato-class submarine that could dive beyond its 400-foot test depth and strike on the surface at night inside 1,000 yards, operated at a different level than the defenses designed for pre-war surface battles. Departing Pearl Harbor on 8 June 1944, and 44 Tang took station along the routes linking Kyushu to northern and continental ports. On the night of 24 June, southwest of Kagoshima, her radar picked up a major convoy, 6 large ships guarded by 16 escorts. O'Kane closed on the surface in darkness, driving inside 1000 yards and firing spreads at overlapping targets. In the space of minutes, 4 ships, Tamahoko Maru, Tainan Maru, Nasusan Maru, and Kenichi Maru, went down together, accounting for 1692 tons of shipping. One of them, Tamahoko Maru, carried hundreds of Allied prisoners of war. When the torpedoes struck, most of those prisoners were killed. In the dark holds below decks, a tragedy. Tang's crew, submerged and evading, could not know, as they listened to the explosions through the hull. Escort vessels answered with depth charges, but Tang slipped away, diving deep and exploiting her speed and maneuverability underwater. The patrol did not end with that convoy. Over the following weeks in the East China and Yellow Seas, she intercepted and destroyed additional transports and tankers, including Nikin Maru, Taiyun Maru, Nober-2, Takatori Maru, Asukazan Maru, Yamaoka Maru, and Dori Maru. By the time she headed back to port in mid-July, post-war analysis would credit that third patrol with 10 ships sunk about 3,900 tons in total. The most successful single U.S. submarine patrol of the war. By number of ships sunk, the human toll ran on both sides of the periscope. Aboard the freighters and transports, Tang hit Japanese merchant sailors, soldiers, and prisoners went into the water with little warning. Inside Tang, the rhythm remained brutally regular: 4-hour watches, hot-bunked racks, red-lit compartments, and tense silences during approaches, while men tracked bearings and ranges by whisper. Depth charge attacks shook gauges and light fittings, but O'Kane, hardened by his time in USS Wahoo, kept driving the boat into close-range night attacks that maximized the chance of hits and minimized the time Japanese escorts had to react. Japan's naval planners still focused on fleets of battleships, and carriers continued to underweight the submarine threat even as losses mounted. Convoys carrying oil, food, and ore sailed with too few dedicated escorts, many of them small, lightly built craft. Tang's ability to appear at night on the surface, fire accurately at short range, then vanish into deep water exposed that weakness patrol after patrol. By the time she refitted for her 4th patrol, Tang's cumulative score was already forcing Japanese analysts to confront an uncomfortable fact: a single American submarine hull. Number SS 306 could erase entire convoys in weeks within the wider U.S. submarine campaign that ultimately sank more than 5.3 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping. Tang's 33 credited sinkings in those 9 months stood out as the record that Japanese officers had never imagined a boat could reach. USS Tang's 3rd patrol in June-July 1944, stalking the East China Sea and Yellow Sea, set the benchmark that Japanese officers would only understand after the war. In just over a month, she sent 10 ships to the bottom for about 3,910 tons, the most ships ever sunk on a single U.S. submarine patrol. Those 10 victims, added to her earlier successes, pushed Tang toward the final tally that would later shock Japanese analysts. 33 ships destroyed in roughly 9 months of combat, totaling 116,454 tons, all carved. Out of a merchant fleet already straining under a U.S. submarine campaign that ultimately erased millions of tons of shipping. After refitting at Pearl Harbor, Tang sailed again on 31 July 1944 for her 4th patrol, this time into Japanese home waters off Honshu. Here she hunted inside the enemy's industrial backyard. On 11 August, she found a pair of freighters with escorts and tore into the formation, sinking the transport Roko Maru before riding out a prolonged depth charge attack. In the nights that followed, she battered Japan's coastal traffic. A small patrol vessel, Nansatsu Maru no. 2, went down under torpedo fire. The transport, Tsukushi Maru, was struck and sunk. Then the tanker, Nanko Maru no 8, followed another blow to fuel movements already under pressure. By the time Tang returned to Pearl Harbor on 3 September, she had proved that one radar-equipped Gato-class submarine could operate with impunity even along Japan's own coasts. 3 weeks later, on 24 September 1944, Tang stood out from Pearl Harbor on her fifth patrol, refueled at Midway Island, and headed alone for the Taiwan Strait, rather than join a coordinated attack group. In mid-October, she intercepted convoys feeding Japan's war effort. On the night of 10–11 October, she sank Joshu-go and Oita-maru cargo ships carrying supplies toward the Empire's frontline garrisons. On 23 October, she broke into the center of a heavily escorted formation of tankers and transports and fired a series of short-range spreads. 5 ships went down in succession, their loss later confirmed in Japanese records. In less than a year, the same hull number SS 306 had dismantled convoy after convoy across 3 different seas. The price came the following night. In the early hours of 24–25 October, while attacking another convoy in the Taiwan Strait, Tang fired her final torpedo, an electric Mark 18 from close range. The weapon malfunctioned, curved into a circular run, and struck the submarine's stern while she was at about 180 feet. The explosion flooded the after compartments and drove Tang to the bottom. A handful of men escaped from the forward torpedo room using Momsen lungs, and a few more were blown or washed clear from topside. Only 9 survived to reach the surface. They were hauled aboard a Japanese escort that already carried burned and wounded survivors from ships. Tang had sunk men, who now recognized the crew of the submarine that had destroyed their convoys. By late 1944, Japan's remaining merchant tonnage had fallen toward the 2-million-ton range, perilously close to the minimum needed just to feed the home islands. Within that collapse, Tang's record stood out: 33 ships in 9 months, a fraction of the more than 1,000 merchantmen sunk by U.S. submarines but concentrated in a single aggressive boat. When Japanese convoy logs and loss lists were compared after the war with O'Kane's patrol reports, naval officers could finally see the pattern written in hull numbers and dates the same American submarine operating again and again from Pearl Harbor had torn through their lifeline at a rate they had never believed one boat could achieve. USS Tang's 5th patrol, ending in her self-inflicted loss on 24 October 1944, capped a campaign in which she was credited with sinking 33 ships, totaling 1,16,454 tons in roughly 9 months. Her attacks in the Formosa Strait, pressed to ranges inside about 1,000 yards, tore into convoys, feeding Japan's war effort at a time when the U.S. submarine force had already destroyed millions of tons of Japanese shipping. Japanese anti-submarine defenses, a mix of undergunned escorts, limited sonar, and only patchy radar coverage, never fully adapted to Tang's radar-guided night attacks or her deep dives beyond official test depth. As her 9 survivors faced captivity after the circular run of her own torpedo, Japan's naval leaders were confronting a submarine campaign they had undervalued for years, one that Tang's record made impossible to ignore. Throughout 1944, Japan's navy still prioritized carrier and surface engagements, leaving convoy protection under-resourced. Merchant ships carrying oil, food, and ammunition often sailed with small subchasers and converted craft, some under 500 tons, crewed by men whose anti-submarine training lagged behind that of their American counterparts. Tang's ability to pick up convoys on radar at many thousands of yards and close for night surface attacks gave her a consistent first strike advantage. Post-war comparisons of Japanese loss records with U.S. The patrol reports showed how far this had gone. Officers who had assumed multiple submarines were attacking their routes learned that a single boat hull number SS 306 had accounted for 33 ships in roughly 9 months of operations. Convoys that had seemed adequately covered by air patrols and scattered routing had in fact been bleeding ships at a rate Japan's yards and crews could not sustain. Japanese survivors pulled from sinking ships described sudden torpedo impacts, hulls breaking, and escorts dropping depth charges with little idea of the attacker's exact position. Tang's attacks, including those of 24 June 1944 inches, the East China Sea, often left escorts reacting against a submarine already deep and maneuvering clear. Japan's merchant fleet, more than 6 million tons at the start of the war, and less than 2 million tons by 1945, could ill afford the 1,16,454 tons credited to Tang alone. Submarines, combined with mines and air attacks, steadily cut the flow of fuel and material to Japanese forces. Post-war studies traced frontline shortages back through these losses, showing how cumulative sinkings had undermined Japan's ability to sustain combat. Tang's loss to her own torpedo, an electric weapon that ran in a circle and struck her stern at about 180 feet, underlined the technical risks of undersea warfare. Torpedo defects had plagued both navies earlier in the war, and in Tang's case, a malfunction turned her trademark close-range accuracy against herself. The escape attempt using mumps and lungs, with only 9 of 87 men ultimately surviving, highlighted how costly submarine service was in a force that suffered a fatality rate far higher than other branches. Yet Tang's record 4 battle stars, 2 presidential unit citations, and the top confirmed total of ships and tonnage sunk by any U.S. submarine set a benchmark. For Japanese analysts, reviewing war records after 1945, the realization that one American submarine could sink 33 ships in such a short span became a numerical expression of the technological, tactical, and doctrinal gap that had helped doom their maritime strategy. The 9 survivors, including Commander Richard O'Kane, endured harsh captivity in Japan's camp system, passing through sites such as Ofuna, a secret naval interrogation center reserved for high-value prisoners. O'Kane, later awarded the Medal of Honor for Tang's final 2 nights of attacks, survived to write "Clear the Bridge," his detailed account of the boat's war patrols. Of the 87 men who sailed on Tang's last patrol, 78 were lost, a stark example of why the submarine force suffered one of the highest casualty rates in the U.S. military during the war. Tang was stricken from the Naval Vessel Register on 8 February 1945 and placed on eternal patrol. Her 33 confirmed sinkings, totaling 116,454 tons under revised post-war assessments, earned 4 battle stars and 2 presidential unit citations, and placed her at the top of the U.S. submarine service for both ships and tonnage sunk. Refits between long patrols had kept her operating at a relentless tempo until the final torpedo turned back on her. After the war, Japanese analysts piecing together convoy losses found the same hull number, SS 306, recurring from the Marianas to the East China Sea and the Formosa Strait. Tang's patrol reports, matched against Japanese shipping records, showed how one submarine had repeatedly broken into routes that planners in Tokyo had assumed were adequately protected. A merchant fleet that had begun the war with roughly 6 million tons of shipping had by 1945 been cut to a fraction of that total. Allied submarines accounted for more than 1,000 Japanese merchantmen and over 5.3 million tons of cargo space, and Tang's 33 sinkings were a concentrated share of that damage. Post-war interrogations and staff studies recorded the surprise of Japanese officers when Allied tallies made clear that a single U.S. boat operating over just 9 months of combat patrols had inflicted the record attributed to Tang. The human cost behind that record did not disappear into tonnage tables. The sinking of Tomahoko Maru on 24 June 1944, with 772 Allied prisoners of war aboard and 560 of them lost, raised difficult questions after the war about the Hell ship system and the realities of unrestricted submarine warfare. Tang's crew, submerged and under depth charge attack, could not know that POWs were among those trapped below decks. Their own escape from the submarine's wreckage using mumps and lungs from 180 feet became the only documented combat use of that apparatus, and a case study in the limits of equipment physiology and training. The National World War II Museum's final mission USS Tang experience, which places visitors inside a recreation of her control room during the last patrol, and O'Kane's memoir, together keep Tang's 33 ship record and the Tang dollars' lives bound up in it in the public eye. In the broader Pacific War, Tang's campaign became a distilled example of how U.S. submarines exploited a technological and doctrinal edge. Radar and aggressive night surface tactics allowed boats like Tang to find and attack convoys at ranges Japanese escorts, often limited to basic sonar and lacking comparable radar, could not match. Japan's emphasis on decisive surface battles and capital ships left too few modern escorts to guard the oil and cargo traffic that sustained its armies and industries. Tang's 33 sinkings in 9 months showed what a single, well-handled Gato-class submarine could do inside that gap, while Japanese submarines achieved far less against Allied trade. For Japanese officers studying the record after 1945, Tang's patrol history helped illustrate why the collapse of their merchant fleet made large-scale war unsustainable. Her story remains a cold numerical measure of how one submarine's patrols contributed to the strangling of an empire's sea lanes. USS Tang's 33 sinkings, totaling 4 tons in roughly 9 months, became one of the clearest numerical markers of the U.S. submarine campaign that shattered Japan's merchant fleet, contributing to the loss of more than 5.3 million tons of shipping. Her destruction on 24 October 1944, when a circular running torpedo struck her stern in about 180 feet of water, left only 9 survivors and a legacy that reshaped how navies thought about undersea warfare. Tang's radar-guided night attacks at very close range, and her willingness to dive beyond her 400-foot test depth on earlier patrols exposed the weakness of Japanese escort forces that had never been equipped or trained to counter such tactics. As her story was carried home by survivors and later preserved in museums and histories, Tang's record became a cornerstone of how the Pacific Submarine War was remembered. Commander Richard O'Kane's post-war account, Clear the Bridge, offered a detailed chronicle of Tang's 5 patrols from her first sinking on 17 February 1944 to her final convoy attacks in the Taiwan Strait. His Medal of Honor, awarded for his leadership during the 23-24 October engagements, recognized both the risks he accepted and the results achieved. 33 confirmed sinkings drawn from the reconciliation of U.S. patrol reports with Japanese loss records. The 9 survivors who passed through camps such as Ofuna returned to describe the escape from Tang's wreck using Momsen lungs, a technical feat at 180 feet that allowed 5 men from the forward torpedo room to reach the surface alive. Of 87 crewmen, 78 died, a loss that mirrored the submarine force's extraordinarily high casualty rate. Tang's hull, SS 306, was stricken from the naval vessel register on 8 February 1945, but her name remains on eternal patrol. Japan's post-war reckoning with the defeat at sea revealed the depth of its miscalculation. Officers studying convoy logs and loss tables found Tang's 33 sinkings as ultimately credited by revised assessments scattered across the Marianas, the East China Sea, the Yellow Sea, and the Formosa Strait. Where they had once assumed multiple submarines were operating, they could now see that a single boat, SS 306, had cut a path through their shipping lanes. A merchant fleet that had stood at about 6 million tons in 1941 had by 1945 fallen below 2 million tons of usable cargo shipping, crippled by submarines, air raids, and mines. Tang's share of that total, a fraction of the roughly 1,300 merchant ships sunk by American submarines, nonetheless stood out in staff studies as evidence of how concentrated the U.S. submarine offensive could be when a single aggressive boat was given good intelligence and the freedom to attack. The National World War II Museum's final mission, USS Tang, exhibit immerses visitors in her last patrol, placing them in a recreation of the control room as torpedoes are fired at close range into a Japanese convoy. 4 battle stars and 2 presidential unit citations mark Tang's battle record, and her 3rd patrol, credited with 10 ships for about 3,900 tons, remains unmatched in the U.S. Navy's submarine history. At the same time, the human costs Allied prisoners of war lost aboard Tomahawk Maru, Japanese sailors and soldiers drowned with their ships, have fueled post-war debates over unrestricted submarine warfare and the Hell ship system. Japanese escorts that had cursed the unseen attacker could not know in the moment that their sonar and late-deployed radar left them outmatched by boats like Tang. Tang's legacy ultimately transcends the numbers in her box score. Her 9-month campaign from January to October 1944 showed how a single well-handled Gato-class submarine could tilt the balance in a maritime war. U.S. submarines, only a small proportion of the fleet, sank more than half of Japan's merchant tonnage, starving its factories and frontline units. Japan's focus on battleships and carriers, and its late limited investment in escorts and anti-submarine warfare created the opening that Tang exploited. Her 33 sinkings, achieved with a crew of 87 men, and a boat repeatedly pushed to the edge of its design limits, embodied that imbalance. Told through O'Kane's memoir museum, displays, and naval histories, Tang's story remains a cold, enduring measure of one submarine's outsized role in Japan's defeat, and a reminder of why post-war Japanese officers could scarcely believe that so much damage had come from a single hull.